The call came at 7:14 on a Tuesday night, and I almost didn't pick up. I was standing in my kitchen in sweatpants, reheating leftover pasta, half watching a home renovation show I didn't care about. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced at the screen. It was my stepmother's accountant. My father's accountant, I should say. The man who had managed the family finances for 22 years before my dad died. I almost sent it to voicemail. I genuinely almost didn't answer. Vivian. His voice was tight in a way I had never heard from him before. Not in 22 years of boring quarterly tax calls. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not go to that cabin this weekend. Do not sign anything your stepmother puts in front of you. I found something, and it's bad. I set down my fork. I want you to think about something before I keep going. Have you ever had a moment where someone handed you a piece of information and your whole past rearranged itself? Like a photo that's been out of focus for years suddenly snapping sharp? Drop a comment if you know what I'm talking about, because that's exactly what happened to me in that kitchen, holding a phone to my ear, pasta going cold on the stove. His name was Gerald. He had worn the same brown cardigan to every meeting I could remember, and he had never once called me after business hours. Not when my father was diagnosed, not when my father died, not for anything. Which is how I knew, before he said another word, that whatever he had found was real. My father passed 14 months before this story starts. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He was 57 years old. He had built a small but serious real estate portfolio over 30 years, a handful of commercial properties in the Mid-Atlantic, a rental duplex in Roanoke, and the mountain cabin in Western Virginia that had been in our family since before I was born. The total value of his estate sat somewhere around $2.5 million. Not generational wealth. Not life-changing for most people, but more than enough to destroy a family. My stepmother's name is Lorraine. She married my father when I was 19, 6 years after my mother died. I want to be fair here because I've spent a lot of time trying to be fair about her. She was never cruel to me in obvious ways. She didn't scream. She didn't exclude me from holidays or pick fights over nothing. She was pleasant in the specific way that pleasant people sometimes are when they need something from you and haven't needed it yet. My father's will left the cabin to me outright. Everything else, the properties, the accounts, the investments, went into a trust with Lorraine as primary beneficiary during her lifetime and me as the remainder beneficiary when she passed. Standard enough for a blended family. He had thought it through. He had been careful. What he hadn't accounted for was what would happen if Lorraine decided she didn't want to wait. The weekend retreat had been her idea. She'd called me 3 weeks earlier with that particular softness in her voice she only used when she wanted something. She said she'd been struggling, said the grief was hitting her harder now than it had right after the funeral. Said she wanted to spend a long weekend at the cabin. My cabin, technically. Though I'd never pushed that point, and that she wanted me there because it would feel too lonely to go alone. I'd said yes. Of course I'd said yes. Because that's what you do. Because I missed my father and the cabin smelled like him, and some part of me thought the trip might help us both. I'd arranged to leave Friday after work. It was now Tuesday, and Gerald was telling me not to go. What did you find? I asked. He exhaled. She retained an attorney 2 months ago, not for estate matters. A different attorney, one who specializes in competency proceedings, conservatorship filings. I didn't say anything. Vivian, she has a document. She had it drafted in September. It's a voluntary asset transfer agreement, essentially a deed of gift. If you sign it, the cabin transfers to her name immediately. Full ownership, no conditions. Why would I sign that? You wouldn't, he said. Not sober. Not if you read it carefully. But there's a notary coming to the cabin on Saturday morning. She has a witness lined up, and she's been telling people, her sister, a neighbor, her pastor, that you've been struggling since your father died, that you've been drinking heavily, that she's worried about your mental state. The air in my kitchen felt different. Thinner. She's been building a record, he said. In case you sign the document and later try to contest it, she has people who will testify that you were in a fragile state. And if you don't sign it, she has grounds to initiate a conservatorship petition on the basis of grief-induced incapacity. That's not how conservatorship works, I said. My voice was very quiet. No, he agreed. It isn't, but by the time it gets sorted out in court, you'll have spent money you don't have on lawyers. Your name will be attached to a mental competency proceeding, and she'll have had time to do other things. She's already made 2 large withdrawals from the estate account that I cannot account for. That's why I started looking in the first place. I stood there in my kitchen and I thought about the last 14 months. And I mean, I really thought about them. The way you think about something when you suddenly have permission to see it clearly. After my father died, I had started to fall apart in small ways. Ordinary grief ways, I told myself. Forgetting things. Losing track of time. There was one stretch of about 6 weeks where I felt genuinely untethered, like I couldn't hold a thought in my hands without it slipping through. I'd mentioned it to Lorraine once, sitting in my father's kitchen going through sympathy cards. She'd nodded slowly and said she'd noticed the same thing. Said I reminded her of a cousin who had gone through something similar after a loss. Said some people just weren't as resilient as others and there was no shame in it. She'd suggested I see someone, a therapist she knew personally, a woman named Dr. Faulkner who operated out of a private practice in Charlottesville. Lorraine said she'd already called and explained the situation and that Dr. Faulkner was very understanding and was happy to take me on as a patient. I went 4 times. I talked about my father. I cried. Dr. Faulkner was warm and patient and asked good questions. I had no reason to be suspicious of anything. Except now I was standing in my kitchen learning that Dr. Faulkner had submitted a written statement, entirely unsolicited, entirely unrequested by me to Lorraine's attorney, summarizing my presenting symptoms as consistent with complicated grief and possible episodic dissociation. I had never given that woman permission to share a single word with anyone. It hadn't been therapy. It had been documentation. I sat down on my kitchen floor, fully on the floor. I'm not sure why, there were chairs 2 feet from me, but my legs just didn't seem interested in holding me up anymore. Gerald was still talking. I heard him in pieces. He was saying he'd already contacted his own attorney, that he had copies of the withdrawal records, that he'd been sitting on this information for 48 hours trying to figure out how to tell me and decided he couldn't wait any longer. "She's expecting you Friday," he said. "I know," I said, "don't go." I looked at the pasta on my stove. Cold now, steam long gone. "Gerald," I said, "if I don't go this weekend, does that stop her?" Silence. "You know it doesn't," I said. "Vivian, she'll reschedule. She'll find another way. She has a notary and an attorney and a therapist who apparently works for her and a network of people who will testify that I'm not in my right mind. If I don't show up Friday, she doesn't stop. She just adjusts." Another silence. Longer. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking I need 48 hours," I said, "and I need you to help me." I didn't sleep that night. I made a list instead. By 8 the next morning, I had an appointment with my own attorney. Not the one who'd handled the estate, a different one. A woman my coworker had used in a property dispute and described as a "she will end you" energy in a blazer. Her name was Petra Holloway and she had an opening at 10 a.m. Because someone had canceled and I took it like a lifeline, I walked her through everything Gerald had told me. She listened without interrupting, which is the sign of either a very good attorney or a very alarming situation. Probably both. "Okay," she said when I finished. "First thing, you need a current psychological evaluation, not from anyone connected to your stepmother. From an independent evaluator today if possible. We need a document with today's date that establishes your baseline competency before you walk into anything she's arranged. Can we do that today?" "I have someone I use for exactly this kind of situation. I'll call while you're sitting here." She made the call. The evaluator had a 2 p.m. slot. "Second thing," Petra said, setting her phone down. "You said the notary is coming Saturday morning?" That's what Gerald thinks. He saw the appointment on her calendar when she asked him to pull some documents for her last week. She didn't realize what she was showing him. Petra nodded slowly. "Don't cancel the trip. Go Friday as planned. But we're going to make some changes to what happens when you get there." She explained it methodically. She would file an emergency motion with the county court on Friday afternoon, challenging the validity of any document executed at the cabin on the grounds of undue influence and documented manipulation. The filing itself wouldn't stop Lorraine, but it would create a timestamp record that predated any signature, which would make contesting the document substantially easier if things went wrong. And if they don't go wrong? I asked. Then you come home Sunday and we proceed with the withdrawal fraud and the HIPAA violation from the therapist. Either way, she loses. Petra looked at me over her reading glasses. But I want you to understand something. Going to that cabin is a choice. You don't have to do this the hard way. She took 2 years building this, I said. If I don't finish it this weekend, she'll rebuild it again somewhere else. I'm done waiting for the next version of this. Petra studied me for a moment. Okay, she said. Then let's talk about what you're going to say when you get there. The psychological evaluation took 2 hours. I sat in a beige office in a medical building off Route 29 and answered questions and completed assessments and talked to a calm, methodical woman named Dr. Kramer, Okafor, who had the energy of someone who had seen every possible variety of human situation and was unimpressed by all of them. When it was over, she handed me a sealed envelope. Your results are consistent with normal grief response, she said. Cognitively intact, no dissociative features. No indication of impaired judgment. I'll have the formal written report to your attorney by 8 tomorrow morning. I sat in my car in the parking lot and cried for about 4 minutes. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that happens when you've been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down feels violent. Then I called my cousin Bethany. Bethany is 22. She is my father's brother's youngest daughter, and she spent every summer at that cabin growing up the same way I did. She and Lorraine had never gotten along. Lorraine found her too loud, too opinionated, too comfortable taking up space, and Bethany had zero reason to hide that feeling. When I explained what was happening, there was a silence of about 3 seconds. Tell me what you need me to do, she said. I drove to the cabin on Friday afternoon as planned. The mountains were doing their October thing, burning red and orange, absurdly beautiful, the kind of scenery that makes you feel like the universe is being ironic. Lorraine had texted twice to ask if I was on my way. Both messages had that texture to them, overly warm with just enough embedded concern to remind me that she was worried about me. She was always worried about me. She was standing on the porch when I pulled in. Cashmere sweater. A glass of white wine already in her hand. She looked like a magazine advertisement for the kind of peaceful mountain weekend where nothing terrible happens. You made it, she said, coming down the steps to hug me. I was starting to worry. The roads can be so tricky in the dark. I'm fine, I said. I stopped for gas. The inside of the cabin was warm. She'd lit candles. There was a charcuterie board on the coffee table and a fire going in the fireplace, and the whole thing was so carefully constructed as a cozy family weekend that I had to focus to keep my face neutral. There was a man I didn't recognize sitting in my father's chair. This is Dr. Renner, Lorraine said, with the particular brightness of someone introducing a pleasant coincidence. He's a colleague of a friend. He's renting the Hendersons' place just up the road for the fall. I ran into him at the general store yesterday and mentioned we'd be here, and he offered to join us for dinner. Isn't that nice? Dr. Renner stood up and shook my hand. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was watching me in a way that had nothing to do with being friendly. Nice to meet you, I said, smiling back. What kind of doctor? Psychiatry, he said. I held his gaze 1 second longer than necessary. What a coincidence, I said pleasantly. Dinner was staged. That's the only word for it. Every element had a purpose. The wine appeared early, and Lorraine kept refilling my glass before it was empty. She steered the conversation toward my father, to memories that would make me emotional, to moments specifically designed to destabilize my composure. She kept referring to things I'd said or done that I had no memory of, like that time you called me at midnight, not sure where you were, fabrications I couldn't disprove in the moment. Dr. Renner asked questions that sounded like dinner conversation but weren't. How was I sleeping? Had I been able to maintain my work schedule? Did I find myself dwelling on the past more than usual? I answered carefully. I performed just enough vulnerability, a slight waver in my voice, eyes that went briefly to the middle distance when someone mentioned my father, to give them what they expected without giving them anything usable. I've just been so worried, Lorraine said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. You seem so lost since we lost him. I keep wondering if there's something more we could be doing for you. I really appreciate that, I said. And I turned to look at her with the most open, grateful expression I have ever manufactured in my entire life. I don't know what I'd do without you. Something flickered behind her eyes. Satisfaction, I think. The look of someone watching a plan arrive exactly on schedule. She had no idea that Bethany was parked a quarter-mile down the road. No idea that Gerald had overnighted a full documentation package to Petra's office that morning. No idea that my phone, propped against my water glass with the camera facing the table, had been recording since I sat down. Lorraine came to my room at 11:30 that night. I was still awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, boots still on. She knocked softly and opened the door without waiting for an answer. A small invasion, the kind she'd been making for years without me registering it as what it was. I just wanted to check on you, she said. She had a mug of tea. She held it out to me. Chamomile. It'll help you sleep. I looked at the mug. I thought about the wine at dinner that I had mostly held but rarely actually drunk. I thought about Dr. Renner watching me from across the table. Thank you, I said. I took the mug. I set it on the nightstand. You really didn't have to do that. She sat on the edge of the bed near my feet, a familiar and uninvited intimacy. I've been thinking, she said, about the cabin, about what makes sense going forward. I know your father left it to you, and I would never want to challenge that, but the maintenance costs are significant, and I just worry that managing a property at your age, with everything you're already carrying, you don't have to worry about that, I said. I've got it handled. She tilted her head. A soft, sad smile. You always say that. I mean it this time. I looked at her. I've been working with an attorney, getting everything properly structured. I should have done it sooner, honestly. Gerald helped me realize a few things that needed attention. The name landed. I watched her face process it in real time. A fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm everything. Gerald, she repeated. I smiled. He's been so helpful. I'm grateful Dad had someone so thorough looking after things. She stood up. Well, she said. The warmth in her voice had changed frequency. Still present, but thinned out. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a good day. She closed the door behind her. I sat there and listened to her walk down the hallway, into the kitchen, and then the low murmur of a phone call. Voice too quiet to make out words. I texted Bethany. She knows something's off. Come at 9, not 10. Bring everything. I slept 4 hours. It was enough. The notary arrived at 9:45. A young man with a messenger bag, apologetic about the muddy driveway, clearly having no idea what he'd driven into. Lorraine let him in with the focused warmth of someone managing a stage production. Dr. Renner was already at the kitchen table. There was a document printed on heavy paper, sitting in a manila folder in the center of the table. Lorraine poured coffee and invited me to sit. We just thought, she said, settling across from me, while we're all together this weekend, it might be a good moment to take care of some housekeeping. Just some straightforward paperwork, to make sure everything is protected. She slid the folder toward me. I opened it. I read the title at the top. Voluntary Transfer of Real Property. I turned the pages slowly. I read every paragraph. I let her watch me read it. I let the silence get long and strange. This transfers the cabin to your name, I said. It simplifies things, she said. For both of us. And Dr. Renner is here too, I looked at him. Just as a witness, he said smoothly. To confirm you're of sound mind and acting freely. Right. I closed the folder. The problem with that, I said, is that I've already had that confirmed. Yesterday afternoon by an independent neuropsychological evaluator whose report is currently in my attorney's possession, time-stamped and signed, establishing my full cognitive competency as of October 17th. I pulled a copy from the inner pocket of my jacket and placed it on the table, which means any claim that I lacked capacity at the time of signing this document would be directly contradicted by documented evidence from 20 hours earlier. The notary had stopped moving. I also want to mention, I continued, that my attorney filed an emergency motion with the county court yesterday afternoon, flagging this address and this weekend and the specific document in that folder as part of a documented pattern of undue influence. It's on the record before I walked in the door this morning. Lorraine's face had gone through several phases and had landed somewhere I didn't have a name for. Vivian, she started. The 2 withdrawals from the estate account, I said. September 11th and October 2nd, $38,000 total. Gerald has the records. Petra has copies. The estate attorney has been notified. Dr. Renner pushed his chair back from the table. If you leave, I said, looking at him, I want you to understand that your name is already in the motion. Participating in a scheme to fraudulently document a person's incompetency is a licensing matter. It might be worth a phone call to your malpractice carrier before you make any decisions. He stayed in his chair. The front door opened. Bethany came in with her jacket still on, carrying a folder of her own, Gerald's documentation, printed and tabbed. She sat down next to me without saying a word, just put the folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it. The notary cleared his throat. I think I need to step outside for a moment. No one stopped him. He didn't come back. You had no right, Lorraine said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was cold and very controlled. I was trying to protect you. You can barely take care of yourself. Your father saw that. Everyone sees it. My father left me this cabin, I said quietly. Not as an oversight. Not because he didn't know what he was doing. Because he trusted me with it. He felt sorry for you. I let that land without reacting, which is, I think, the hardest thing I've ever done. The withdrawals need to be returned to the estate account by November 1st, I said. Petra has drafted a repayment agreement. If it's signed and returned by end of business Monday, there will be no referral to the Commonwealth's attorney. If it isn't, there will be. You can't. I can. I have. Gerald documented everything. The estate attorney is already involved. I stood up. I'm going to spend the rest of this weekend here because this is my cabin and I have every right to. I'd appreciate it if you and Dr. Renner made other arrangements. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something collapse behind her eyes. Not dramatically, not in tears. Just a quiet structural failure, like a wall that's been load-bearing for too long finally giving way. She left within the hour. Doctor time. Renner's car was already gone before she finished packing. Bethany and I sat on the porch that afternoon and watched the mountains go gold in the late light, and didn't say much for a long time. She brought snacks. We ate chips out of the bag and drank the good coffee I'd brought from home and listened to the wind and the trees. How long do you think she was planning it? Bethany asked eventually. I don't know, I said. A while, probably before my father was even gone. That's the part that gets me. She shook her head. She was planning it while he was still alive. I thought about that. I'd been thinking about it for 2 days, in the hours when I wasn't making calls or signing documents or rehearsing conversations. My father had married someone who started calculating before he was finished dying. I didn't know how to hold that thought without it breaking something, so mostly I set it down carefully and came back to it in small pieces. He didn't know, I said. He picked her before she was this. Maybe, Bethany said. Or maybe people are always who they are, and they just need the stakes to be high enough. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm still not sure I do. Lorraine signed the repayment agreement on Sunday morning. Petra called to tell me while I was still at the cabin, sitting in the same chair my father used to read in on Sunday mornings, holding a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Dr. Renner surrendered his psychiatry license 6 weeks later. The state medical board doesn't take participation in conservatorship fraud lightly, as it turns out. The estate account was restored. The cabin stayed in my name. Gerald got a very nice bottle of bourbon from me at Christmas, which he seemed genuinely touched by. Lorraine and I have not spoken since she drove away from the cabin that Saturday. I don't expect we will. I spent a long time feeling guilty about that, the specific guilt of a daughter-in-law who can't make something work, who couldn't find a way to keep the peace. I've been working on putting that guilt down. My therapist, my actual therapist, who I found myself, whose notes belong to me, says it's a process. Bethany came up for Thanksgiving. We cooked too much food and watched old home videos on my dad's ancient laptop and cried a reasonable amount and laughed more than I expected. I lit a fire in the fireplace that he built with his own hands in 1987. In the cabin, he left me because he trusted me with it. That's enough. That's actually enough. The people in our lives who truly love us don't build files on us. They don't send us to doctors who report back to them. They don't arrive at mountain cabins with notaries and asset transfer agreements tucked in manila folders. Love doesn't need paperwork designed to trap you. If someone in your life is documenting your vulnerability, they are not protecting you. They are preparing a case. Trust the people who call you when they find something wrong. Trust the people who drive a quarter-mile down a dark road and wait in a cold car because you ask them to. Trust the ones who show up with a folder and sit down next to you without being asked. Everything else is just someone else's plan for your life, and you're allowed to rewrite the ending. I've been thinking a lot about what it actually takes to get to the other side of something like this. Not the legal part, the inside part. The part where you stop blaming yourself for not seeing it sooner. For a long time after that weekend at the cabin, I kept replaying the 2 years I'd spent believing I was the problem. The fogginess. The forgetting. The way I'd sit with Lorraine and absorb her concern like it was nourishment when it was actually the opposite. I kept thinking, how did I miss it? I'm not an unintelligent person. I have a job, a lease, a functioning life. How did I sit across from someone who was building a case against me and thank her for her kindness? The honest answer is that I trusted her because I needed to. My father was gone and she was what remained of the life I'd had with him, and grief will make you hold on to whatever is still standing. That's not stupidity. That's just being human in the worst possible moment. The cruelty of what she did, what she and Dr. Renner were doing, is that it was engineered to exploit exactly that. She didn't target my weakness, she manufactured it. There's a difference, and it matters. What I've come to understand is this. The actions we take always produce consequences that outlast our intentions. Lorraine spent 2 years constructing something she believed was airtight. She had documents, witnesses, a compliant psychiatrist, a strategy with multiple contingencies. She was thorough, and every single piece of that thoroughness became evidence against her. Because Gerald was more thorough and Petra was sharper and Bethany drove out on a cold night without being asked twice. The effort Lorraine put into the trap is the same effort that dismantled it. That's not poetic justice. That's just the math of how choices compound over time. I think about Gerald a lot. He found something wrong and he sat with it for 48 hours, turning it over, making sure he understood it. And then he called me at 7 in the evening and said the uncomfortable thing as directly as he could. He didn't have to do that. It wasn't his property. It wasn't his fight. But integrity doesn't work on a case-by-case basis. It's either a habit or it isn't. He had spent 22 years being the kind of person who notices things and says so. And that's exactly why he was the one who caught it. I've tried to apply that to my own life since then. To be the kind of person who, when they see something wrong, doesn't wait to see if someone else will say it first. It's harder than it sounds. It costs something every time. But I have a very clear example in my head now of what happens when someone makes that call, and what might have happened if he hadn't. The cabin is still mine. I went up last month by myself just for a weekend, and I sat on the porch my father built and drank coffee and watched the mountains do their thing in the early light. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. I didn't take anything for granted about it. The people who try to take things from you by making you doubt yourself are counting on one thing, that your uncertainty will outlast their patience. The answer to that is not to become hard or suspicious of everyone. The answer is to know yourself well enough that someone else's narrative about who you are doesn't stick. Build the record of your own life clearly enough that no one else can rewrite it. That's what I'm working on now. It takes longer than a weekend at a mountain cabin. But I've got time.